Hello Year 10 and welcome to your second lesson focusing on the poem Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. Your date is Monday the 1st of February 2021. Your title is Kamikaze Part 2. And as ever, there is a retrieval quiz there on the screen. Number 1, what is free verse? Number 2, how is sibilance created? Number 3, what did Garland say she had an interest in that influenced her writing of the poem? Number 4, how is conflict presented in the form and structure of the poem? And number 5, the pilot suffers on his return from his mission because... Finish that sentence. Pause the video, get the date and title down, underlined, have a go at each of those questions on the screen. Play again when you're ready to go through the answers. Okay, hopefully by now you've managed to have a go at each of those questions. We are going to move on to have a look at the answers. Please do mark your answers as we go. So question number 1 was, what is free verse? Free verse is an open form of poetry. It does not follow a particular structure, but it tends to reflect the natural rhythm of speech. Number 2, how is sibilance created? Sibilance is created when strongly stressed consonants produce hissing sounds. We've got an example of it there with hissing sounds, all right, with the S's. Number 3, what did Garland say she had an interest in that influenced her writing of the poem? Garland has stated that she had a particular interest in what can motivate young men and women to give up their lives in service of a higher cause. That was one thing, a really interesting piece of contextual information that will come in handy with our knowledge of this poem. Number 4, how is conflict presented in the form and structure of the poem? What things combined to present conflict? So in the poem, the strict structure of the poem, it's got 7 stanzas, each with 6 lines, is juxtaposed against the poet's use of free verse and enjambment, which creates conflict between the tight structure and the flow of words on the page. This reflects the conflict between the pilot's national duty and his internal conviction. And number 5, the pilot suffers on his return from his mission because he did not complete his mission, something that would have brought great honour to his family. His family shunned him because of his decision. Okay, remember kamikaze pilots were especially trained Japanese pilots who their job was to go and crash into enemy ships and blow them up in the process. Well, obviously that would mean it was a one-way trip. But it was seen as very honourable to die for your country, and this is something he then didn't do. Okay, so he didn't bring that honour to his family in the end. Mark your answers. If you got them right, well done. If you got any of them incorrect, please make a note of those ones as being ones to revisit. Pause the video if you need to, but otherwise, moving on. So today's aims are to explore the use of language in the poem and to identify which poems would identify well or would compare well with Kamikaze. Having a look at language then. So remember, when we're looking at language, the things we're looking at the individual words or phrases in a poem and their overall effect on the poem. This is when we zoom in on the actual words on the page. And we consider the ways in which the poet uses language in a particular way to have an effect. We're looking for things such as metaphors, similes, personification, pathetic fallacy. While we're here on this slide, if you need to reread the poem there just to remind yourself of what happens in it, please feel free to do so, but I will continue on for the next task. So the sort of questions we need to contemplate when we're looking at language, we need to consider when we read the poem, what words or phrases stand out? Why do they stand out? How do the words used link to the overall idea of the poem? Can we identify any poetic devices? And how do these devices link to the meaning of the poem? Just a quick reminder, one of the biggest themes that features through this poem is conflict, and primarily the conflict between the pilot's sense of national duty, his role as a soldier, as a pilot to go and complete his mission, and between his personal conviction, his wish to kind of return home and be safe and be with those he loves. Okay, you've got those two different sides of things going on: national duty, personal conviction, so to speak. So what we're going to look at specifically in this poem, I'm going to get you to do in just a moment. I'm going to get you to pause and consider, can you find any imagery linked to nature? Can you identify a dangerous figure? Can you find anything to do with brainwashing? I also want you to look for some similes and metaphors. There is an answer to each of these questions, okay? So do pause the video, have a look at each of these questions. You don't need to write anything down as such, just have a look through, see what you can identify before I go through these things in a bit more detail. Moving on to consider the language in more detail, then I'm going to start by just looking at this first stanza, well then I will look at carrying on some of the ideas that appear in this first stanza, tracing them throughout the poem afterwards. All right, so we're going to start at the beginning here. Her father embarked at sunrise. Looking at that word embarked, they're highlighted in purple. This suggests that the pilot is going on a journey from which we know he will not return. If you embark somewhere, it means you're going somewhere, okay? And then I'm going to focus on this word sunrise, okay? If you've got your notes in front of you, I would recommend highlighting these words, making your annotations along with them. So with regards to the sunrise, Japan is known as the land of the rising sun, if you look at the flag, and the Japanese military flag depicts a sunrise. So as well as it having that link to the military, you've also got a piece of natural imagery there, all right, a piece of nature, the sun rising. And this can link once again to conflict, because it shows a conflict between the freedom that nature connotes and the control of the military, with the two different meanings to the word sunrise there. And the next thing I'm going to focus on in that stanza is the phrase here, powerful incantations. So her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. This idea of the powerful incantations that I have highlighted there, this suggests that the pilot is under some kind of spell, which hints at how the pilot has, in a sense, been brainwashed by the military into completing the mission. He's been told that it will bring great honor upon your family, onto you, it is an honor to die for your country, all this kind of thing. Okay, this is how he's been persuaded into completing such a task. So moving on to look at the natural imagery that features in the poem in a bit more detail. I have decided just to pop it all on the screen at once to save the time where I need to type it up, but I will read us through it. So we've already talked about the sunrise and how that presents one form of conflict. You've got the sunrise in the natural image, thing that happens in nature, the sun rising in the morning, and the military, because the sunrise features on the Japanese military flag. So again, keeping up with that conflict. The next bit I'm going to zoom down to focus on is this description here of the sea as being a green, blue, translucent sea. And it's interesting because this is where the pilot first begins to take notice of nature. He's left on his journey with this head full of these powerful incantations and this belief that he has to go and complete his mission. And all of a sudden, he does become distracted by this green, blue, translucent sea. And I say, this is where the pilot first begins to take notice of nature. It's nature imagery, natural imagery. And this is what we're going to trace in all of these annotations highlighted in orange here. Because in the next stanza, we then move to focus in on the fishes that the pilot sees in the water, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun. And what we have here is an example of sibilance. Remember, we talked about sibilance being an example of where hissing sounds are made with the use of particular consonants. So common letters that you tend to see forming sibilants are S's or sh or z. But if you do listen to me say this out loud, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swivel towards the sun. There's a lot of noises. And the sibilance here creates a sense of energy and reflects the smooth movements taking place in the sea beneath him. Sibilance is often linked to sort of calm and things like that. And it helps to capture the natural wonder of the fish. This idyllic description contributes, spelled that incorrectly, the contributes would have an E there, contributes to the idea that it was the power of nature that helped the pilot to change his mind, okay? These are annotations you should be aiming to get down, highlights. You don't have to write it down word for word, how I have, but you need to have the same kind of ideas written down. So yes, this idyllic description contributes to the idea that it was the power of nature that helped the pilot to change his mind. And this is interesting because one thing that I believe Garland actually said herself is that, so the beauty of nature shows us why he should not want to deprive himself and hundreds of other young men in the ship he was supposed to have annihilated of that intense pleasure of that, of being able to see scenes such as this, such beautiful, wondrous scenes. Okay, and this is another theme that will come into play here, is the idea of the power of nature versus the power of man. Nature is having such an impact on the kamikaze pilot here. It's made him stop concentrating on his mission and take note of the scenery around him. And this nature will then begin to have that impact on him that in the end forces him, or kind of entices him into turning around and not carrying on with his mission. Okay, because he begins to think, do I really want to deprive myself and all those people that I could kill of scenes such as this, being able to appreciate nature in this way, and is that nature having that power over the pilot in this scene. Linking back to the daughter's belief, as she says here, but halfway there she thought, recounting it later to her children, she believes that it was nature that helped him to change his mind and the impact of nature on him. The next part I'm going to look at is in the fourth stanza here, where it says, built cairns of pearl grey pebbles. You will remember from looking back at the dictionary that a cairn is a pile of pebbles, okay, normally used to mark something. And often these cairns are actually built in order to commemorate death, and they are signs that somebody has died. As I've put here, cairns are usually associated with death, and this imagery of death reminds the reader of what is at stake for the pilot, making that link back to death. We're about halfway through describing all of our nature at this point. Okay, but again, just sort of thinking back here, this is what is at stake. Look at all this beautiful nature we have going on here. But, you know, death is sort of on the line. And I'm going to take us on to the fifth stanza up here, okay? And this last line here, a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. So at this point, the daughter is recounting what the grandfather would have brought back on the boat. We've got mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And this is a really interesting description of this tuna, right, the fish. It is a metaphor, okay? The tuna is being described as a prince. So the metaphor here, this dark prince is described as being threatening, intense, and powerful. All right, it's muscular, it's dangerous, which kind of links back to that idea of the power of nature versus the power of man. This fish here is being presented as more dangerous and more powerful than mankind. And this line also features the first full stop in the poem when we looked at the enjambment earlier. This is the first place where a full stop appears, which suggests this is a place where the reader needs to stop and pay attention. All right, the poem is signifying to us to stop here, think about what's just come before you move on. Okay, and again, this is why this natural imagery that features in the poem is really important, because it is kind of showing that power of man versus the power of nature. And in essence, nature is winning. It's nature that helps to convince the pilot to turn around and not go and complete his mission as he originally planned. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to consider some more of the language in relation to this idea of the powerful incantations that the pilot has within his head. That link to the influence the military has had on him. He has these powerful incantations, almost these spells have been cast on him to persuade him and convince him to train as a kamikaze pilot and to go on these missions from which he will never return. All right, and we're just going to trace how this develops kind of through the poems. We know we have the powerful incantations there, but moving on to the second stanza, the daughter notes, but halfway there she thought, recounting it later to her children, you must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting. We've got an example of one simile there. The little fishing boats being described like bunting, like the flags that are hung up for parties. They're a colourful festive decoration. And then it continues, on a green blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag waved first one way and then the other in a figure of 8. We've got another simile there to describe the fishes. The dark shoals of fishes are being described as arcing in swathes, like a huge flag being waved, another sort of symbol of celebration. And looking at my annotations over here, these similes link to ideas of celebration, which links to the power of the incantations the pilot has in his head. The pilot is under the belief that the sacrifice he is about to make will be celebrated. So what we're looking at again is the influence and the power that the military has on him. Okay, but it's also interesting to note that these similes tend to feature at the beginning of when he begins to sort of take notice of the nature around him. And interestingly, references to things like celebration and whatnot, these incantations tends to kind of, they drift off. You don't see any more of them throughout the poem, but obviously, again, this is where he's beginning to take note of nature. So it could almost be noted, and I will actually add this onto the screen, as the power of nature takes effect, takes hold of the pilot, all references to the military's power over him disappear. Okay, again, just as an interesting thing to note. All right, so again, it's that power of nature, power of man scenario. Nature is proving to be more powerful than mankind because nature is causing him to lose all these preconceptions of what will happen to him or how his plight will be celebrated as he begins to take notice of all of the nature around him, and he starts to think to himself, why would I deprive anybody of being able to experience this? Okay, and that all comes into play as to how he turns around. But it's interesting though, I've decided to focus on the end of the poem in this slide as well, because where we have this awareness that his sacrifice will be celebrated, we know it would be, as we've said, there is this belief, or there was this belief that going and completing a mission such as this would result in honour being brought to your family, you'd be celebrated as a national hero, that kind of thing. And obviously he decides not to complete the mission. He returns home to be shunned by his family. He did not bring his family honour. And this is noted in these final two stanzas. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chatted and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. We switch to italics here as the narrator switches to the first person, and is kind of recounting that memory of what happened when her son returned as a child. But as we switch back to the third person in these last two sentences, these are particularly poignant. It says, and sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. And what we have here is a really tragic ending. The pilot finds himself metaphorically dead. He decided to turn around and not die on his mission. He decided to come home. But he is now sat here wondering whether a literal death as a kamikaze pilot might have been better than this emotional death. He's come home and essentially been treated as though he doesn't exist by his family. He is essentially dead in a figurative sense. It's as if he is truly dead, as he is treated like a ghost. He is treated as though he does not exist. So he kind of ponders, would it have been better had I died out in the plain as part of my mission, or would I prefer to be back here being ignored by everybody that I love? which leads on to this question. The pilot's choice to come home was futile, which is what he thought about the mission. You know, this mission to go and destroy these boats. It is a futile mission because why would I want to deprive people of these things? But now he's saying that, you know, the pilot's choice to come home was futile. And I suppose his decision to come home could almost be seen as similar to a kamikaze mission in itself, because he's still dead in a sense. So he is wondering, would it have made any difference had he done it on the plane, or having come home and experiencing what he's experiencing from his family. Now, the last thing I'd like to focus on in this poem is just the use of positive and negative language all the way through. Remember, like I said at the beginning, in a poem such as this, when you're looking for conflict, you're generally going to be looking for opposites. Right? So we already know that we've got the difference between, or the confliction between the pilots want to not go on this mission and go home, and his sense of national duty and what the military has asked him to do as a kamikaze pilot. So we're always looking for opposites. So what I've highlighted on the screen now are examples of positive and negative words that do feature alongside each other in the poem. So you've got positive words such as sunrise, bunting, safe, laughed, loved, right? Words that have positive connotations, alongside words that have more negative connotations such as dark, turbulent, black, muscular, dangerous, die. All right, and this mixture of positive and negative words throughout the poem reflects the inner conflict the pilot has between his national duty and his personal conviction. Okay, the last annotation to make with regards to language, make sure you highlight those words and get that annotation down. It doesn't need to be in all the words that I've used, but getting it down in a way that you know you can understand and you can use. Pause the video if you need to, but I am going to clear the screen to move on to the next part. So now that we've thoroughly looked through the use of language in the poem, I'm aware that there's a fair bit going on there, but it is all incredibly interesting and in linking to the theme of the poem and those ideas of conflict. The next thing I'm going to note are the poems that compare well with Kamikaze. I know you haven't looked at some of these poems yet, but it's useful to have that list available to you to refer to at a later date. And the blue annotate bubble is there, so do please note these down, okay? Poems that will compare well with Kamikaze include War Photographer, Exposure, Poppies, The Prelude, Ozymandias, and Tissue, okay? All poems that we will come to at some point. We're going to be doing Poppies next after Kamikaze. Once you've noted that down, if you do have any time left for today, as always, I would recommend spending some time creating some self-quizzing questions based on the content of this lesson to aid in your revision. All right, if you do find yourself with some spare time, I would always recommend keeping the answers away from the questions when it comes to your self-quizzing questions. So whether you do perhaps flashcards, where you have the question on one side and the answer on the other, or even if you write your questions on one piece of paper and your answers on another. The key is not to have the answer directly in front of you when you do look at the question, so that your brain actually has to do some work to think about the answer. It's not just in front of you for you to refer to. But otherwise, that is all for today. Remember, today's aims were to explore the use of language in the poem and to identify which poems would compare well with Kamikaze. I feel we've done both of those. All right. Tomorrow we will move on to look at the next poem, Poppies. If you have any questions about anything to do with any of these lessons, please do get in touch with your English teacher. Otherwise, well done for today's work. Your next lesson will be up tomorrow. Take care, and I'll see you again soon.